I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I was raised, the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I was raised mostly in the greater Lismore area, which was inhabited by the Widjabul Aboriginal people until it was invaded by European cedar cutters in the 1860s. Growing up here, it was easy to be ignorant to the fact that I was raised and educated on sacred stolen land. Architecturally, Alstonville is part colonial, part white brick supercluster. I recall associating my Australianness with my whiteness. Our totems were white war heroes, business owners were white, my educators were white. I recall seeing murals in local towns, but because there was so little representation of First Nations peoples, I didn't make the connection between the artworks in the Bundjalung Nation. I attributed the murals to the region's amorphous hippie culture, ignorant to the fact that they were site-specific reflections of the land I was occupying, and they were Aboriginal. Despite the pervasiveness of the white imaginary, First Nations peoples have carved out some significant vanguards of colonial resistance in the area, such as the Koori Mail and an Indigenous health service. Bundjalung elders have a voice to the local Rouse Council, providing insights into how to manage the land and water in a sustainable way. Lismore High has undergone an Indigenous renaming project whereby students and teachers renamed classrooms things like Ngulibu, meaning all of us. The greater Lismore area is also home to at least 2 Bora rings, places of deep significance where communing and exercising of rituals would take place. What is now the Lismore Showground was a very important ceremonial meeting place for Bundjalung people, as well as for the neighbouring Aboriginal nations. Some efforts have been made to acknowledge the significance of the site by installing an elders' tent, the painting of large murals, and a book commemorating its history. While I see these changes as meaningful steps in the direction of decolonisation, it does not constitute social justice. Land reparations must take place. Ownership of traditional sacred sites must be returned to their traditional owners. Cultural representation must be matched with changes in leadership locally and nationally. The Uluru Statement from the Heart clearly outlined the need for a direct voice to Parliament, and this was ignored. I imagine an Aboriginal land with a multicultural population, rather than a country where European ethnocentrism sets the tone for interactions with land, knowledge, and each other. A country where Indigenous leaders guide us back to our harmonious relationship with land and sea, instead of continuing to enforce an outdated colonial perspective on land as something to exploit. I believe in a pay-the-rent tax system whereby all Australians contribute to a fund that is managed by elected Indigenous professionals and elders. I must acknowledge the hegemonic superstructure of white supremacy within which First Nations peoples are having to forge their voice. I must recognise that a paternalistic approach has not worked, that the deficit paradigm is disabling, and that collaborative steps toward land rights and political autonomy are crucial. I must recognise that my privilege has relied on the subjugation of First Nations peoples, and I must leverage that privilege as an advocate and counsellor, remembering that indigeneity in Australia intersects with intergenerational trauma. My actions must reflect an attempt to repair the violence with which my people have walked into the Aboriginal dreamtime, and my responsibility as a settler is to humbly unlearn, to constantly remember that it always was, always will be Aboriginal land.